Chapter 18, Nudists. One of the most useful lessons that Strongheart taught me centered around the old adage, thoughts are things. No one ever taught the dog that saying. Nevertheless, he knew a great deal about it. I recall having been exposed to the phrase during my early school days, and many times since, without giving it more than casual interest. To me, it had always seemed merely a philosophical abstraction, something to toss about vocally if the conventional winds were in that direction, but nothing to take seriously in these hard-boiled, realistic, and practical days. But Strongheart, in our Dog Trains Man educational curriculum, drove home to me the facts that thoughts really are things. He taught me this particular lesson speedily and indelibly, not only for my greater good as a living entity, but for my protection as I moved about the earth meeting other entities. He forced me to realize that the making and breaking instrument in all my contacts with him was my own thinking, my own state of mind, my own inner attitude. Not his thinking or his state of mind or his inner attitude, but mine. I saw that I was primarily responsible for whatever happened in our relationship, and that the responsibility lay not so much in what I said or did, but in what I was up to mentally. Two facts were becoming increasingly important in the lessons. First, Strongheart and I were mental beings, before we could possibly be objectified or material expressions of life. Therefore, it was as mental beings that the dog and I rightly had to relate to ourselves in order to have the rest of us rightly related too. Whenever I worked it from this angle, Strongheart and I always moved in perfect accord. The second fact was that every least thought thing that I sent in Strongheart's direction, whether good, bad, or indifferent, almost invariably boomeranged right back at me in some correspondingly outward action. This action from me and swift reaction from him were so echo-like and precise that I had to be constantly on the alert, and every stranger visiting him had to be cautioned about it. Occasionally, when this caution was omitted, Strongheart would detect something in the mental atmosphere of the visitor that he did not like, and sometimes this collision of the unblendable human and dog states of mind resulted in a rough experience for the visitor. Strongheart knew, but very few of his visitors guessed, that each of them was constantly broadcasting the real facts about himself, his thinkings, his feelings, and his emotions. Nothing that any of them did on the outside could possibly hide these facts from the dog or from any other alert animal. Detecting the mental inwardness of the visitors in this manner, he dealt with them accordingly. Those who got roughed up always wondered why a great dog like Strongheart should have treated them in such an unsocial and undeserving manner. A most important and most embarrassing thing that my four-legged trainer drilled into me was this: no matter where I happen to be or what I am doing, my mind is always much more on display than the physical body and the clothes I happen to be wearing. Neither my inner life, nor his inner life, nor the inner life of any other living thing is private or unconcealable. We are all mental nudists, always on public display for all freely to observe and evaluate. The dog made me very watchful of my motives and very careful of the kind of thinking I diffused, especially when I was with him. And he got me to do some genuine repair work on my character and my conduct. There was no choice in the matter. I had to accept this personal discipline in order to keep our relationship balanced and functioning intelligently. Practically every lesson that Strongheart taught me had to do with my mental attitude and its reaction on him, on us, and on the various things we were doing or were unable to do. Accompanying each one of these lessons was the indirect but important reminder that he and almost all other animals, except those spoiled by human association, always live out from a pure heart, that is, from pure motives. He made it clear that if I wanted to get along with him or any other living thing, I must live out from a pure heart and from pure motives as well. The more I tried to purify my thinking, my character, my purposes, and my actions, and to blend the best of me with the best of him in everything we did, the more the big dog and I began moving out beyond the restricting and unreal boundaries of our respective species. We found ourselves operating in the boundless realm of the mental and the spiritual, where each of us could function fully and freely as an individual state of consciousness, and together as fellow states of mind in an adventure that seemed to have no frontiers whatsoever. Chapter 19, Imprisoned Splendor. Now came the crowning achievement in my kinship adventure with Strongheart. He shared a fascinating secret with me, a mystery that had baffled professional dog handlers, Hollywood entertainment producers, and countless thousands of his admirers all over the world. This was the mystery. What had been done with Strongheart behind the scenes so successfully to transform him from a dangerous and difficult to manage war dog into an understanding and friendly motion picture star? I did not get the answer to this question from Strongheart all at once, but bit by bit as we shared silent talk together. If you would understand this secret, you must first understand the distinction between training an animal and educating one. Trained animals are relatively easy to turn out. All that is required is a book of instructions, a certain amount of bluff and bluster, something to use for threatening and punishing purposes, and of course the animal. Educating an animal, on the other hand, demands keen intelligence, integrity, imagination, and a gentle touch, mentally, vocally, and physically. The most significant difference between training and educating an animal, I learned from Strongheart, lies in the matter of emphasis. It depends on whether one places emphasis on the mental or the physical part of the animal. The conventional trainer, following traditional and rigid patterns, places his emphasis almost entirely on the physical. As long as his animal looks its best and obeys orders promptly, he is satisfied. This result is limited to the animal and stereotyped in its results. The conventional trainer starts from a negative premise. He assumes that he is working with a dumb and inferior form of life, which even at its best can only go so far in intelligence and accomplishments because of its limited brain capacity. If he happens to be working with a dog, his primary ambition is so to dominate the animal that it will be completely subservient to him, obey his every command, and treat him with idolatrous attention at all times. It is as though he were constantly saying to the dog, "Now don't forget, you down there, I am your lord and master, so follow and do everything I say or else." Most of the animals that man has used to serve his own selfish ends down through the centuries have been products of this training without education system. A minimum of intelligence and a maximum of force are employed in order to compel blind obedience. In professional circles, this is known as the make 'em or break 'em technique. The animal's resistance is so broken down and its spontaneity and initiative so dulled that it supinely does whatever the trainer demands. With its thinking and natural impulses walled off, it becomes a four-legged slave, submissively serving the moods and whims of the human ego that is playing God to it. The animal educator does just the reverse of all this. Moving into the situation with insight and intuition, he places full emphasis on the mental rather than on the physical part of the animal. He treats it as an intelligent fellow being whose capacity for development and expression he refuses to limit in any direction. He knows that the animal's appearance, actions, and accomplishments are only the outward expressions of its state of mind. He seeks to help the animal make use of its thinking faculties, so that there will be corresponding results in its looks, character, and actions. When Strongheart began his motion picture career in Hollywood, he was a splendid example of both a well-trained and a well-educated dog. The training and educating had taken place on different sides of the Atlantic Ocean. In Germany, he had been carefully trained into a highly efficient police and war dog, into a heavily regimented state of thinking and acting in which practically everything was planned and managed for him. When he first arrived in the United States, he was a good example of a well-trained but uneducated dog. In spite of his physical magnificence and his accomplishments and awards, he was lopsided, out of proportion, off balance. He was a long way from having the kind of development that rightfully belonged to him. A great dog in a way, he was actually a great liability unless one was planning to take part in a public or private war. Yet out of that lopsidedness, with the understanding and patient help of Larry Trimble, there blossomed one of the best balanced, best educated, and most successful dogs in all history. It was not an easy achievement, even for Trimble. Strongheart was aggressive, set in his ways, and opposed to changing his thinking and behavior patterns. His attitude towards Larry during many challenging and almost hopeless weeks of experimenting was an ever-ready-to-explode mixture of superiority, dislike, indifference, and annoyance. He was constantly suspicious and watchful to see when Trimble, whom he regarded as an enemy in disguise, would start the anticipated trouble. No command and compulsion efforts were used in getting Strongheart out of his militant attitudes. Trimble, with wisdom sharpened by long experience with animals, spent long periods of time alone with the big combat dog on an isolated farm, giving Strongheart all possible freedom, studying all the things he did, searching for the motivating reasons back of them, and trying to figure out what could be done to help his potential screen star into a better and more shareable sense of life. After many weeks, Trimble found the secret by means of which Strongheart was transformed from one state of mind to another, from a belligerent war dog to a sympathetic, intelligent, and cooperative movie star. Trimble discovered that deep within the big combat dog, but solemnly imprisoned there, was a wealth of magnificent character qualities. Those talents and graces buried beneath the dog's toughest physical exterior did not need to be developed, but liberated. This is what Trimble proceeded to do. The blueprint for the education of Strongheart might have been borrowed from the famous line of Robert Browning's Paracelsus. Truth is within ourselves, it takes no rise. From outward things, whatever you may believe, there is an inmost center in all of us. Where truth abides in fullness and around, wall upon wall, the gross flesh hems it in. This perfect, clear perception, which is truth, a baffling and perverting carnal mesh, blinds it and makes all error, and to know rather consists in opening out a way, whence the imprisoned splendor may escape, than in effecting entry for a light, supposed to be without. With penetrating perception and deft but gentle technique, Trimble began opening out all sorts of ways for Strongheart's imprisoned splendor to escape into expression. At first the expression was meager because of the newness of the experience, but then it came in spontaneous abundance. The big war dog was helped to know, to be, and to share more of his real self. And it was this unrestricted sharing of his real self which enabled Strongheart to accomplish the most incredible things he did, and to achieve his unsurpassed rating in the world of entertainment. This is the framework of the secret that Strongheart shared with me across our invisible bridge for two-way thought traffic, and Larry Trimble subsequently confirmed in every detail. But as then, so now, it is a difficult secret for the conventional-minded to grasp, contain, and use in a practical way, because of its divinely motivated simplicity and naturalness. Chapter 20, Rattlesnakes. There is a great practical value in the art of carefully supervising one's thoughts and motives in contacts with other living things, particularly with such creatures as rattlesnakes. These wise but little understood fellows, with their poison-brewing skill and deadly defense techniques, are experts of the first magnitude in dealing with thought emanations, especially as they come from a human. When I first visited those parts of the West where white men and Indians frequently cross trails with rattlesnakes, and when I do so myself, it was a shivery experience. I saw some of them whirl into action with their hypnotic eyes and their lightning lunges with heavily poisoned fangs. They were thorough, terrifying, and deadly killers. One day, an old desert prospector, who had had rattlesnakes as neighbors for as long as he could remember, told me a surprising thing. He said that while rattlesnakes take special delight in sinking their fangs into a white man, they seldom harm an Indian. I asked him why. He did not know and had never tried to find out. In my travels, I found that what the old prospector had said was true. The rattlesnakes were indeed selective. They were biting the white men, and they were extending almost complete immunity to the Indians. I talked to all kinds of snake experts, but none of them gave me a satisfying answer. Certainly none gave me an answer that I would have wanted to try out on a diamondback rattler. Almost everywhere I went, there was vicious and relentless warfare going on between white men and rattlesnakes. It was warfare to the death of either the man or the snake. But I could find no such warfare between the Indians and the rattlesnakes. There seemed to be a kind of gentleman's agreement between them. In all my journeyings in deserts, prairies, and mountains, I never once saw a rattlesnake coil, either by way of defense or attack, when an Indian walked into its close vicinity. My dog-trains man sessions with Strongheart had shown me the trouble that unforeseen mental forces can cause in one's contact with animals, and so I was able to understand why there was warfare between white men and rattlesnakes, but practically none at all between the Indians and the snakes. This situation between the humans and the snakes confirmed what Strongheart had been so patiently trying to teach me, that one's thinking in all its nakedness always precedes him and accurately proclaims his real nature and intention. The mysterious human rattlesnake paradox was solved for me by the teaching of the dog. The answer had to do with individual states of mind, with the kind of character atmosphere that was being diffused with projected thought forces or forces. Almost every rattlesnake that I watched illustrated this illuminating relationship point for me. The snakes were able to detect and correctly appraise the particular kind of thinking that was moving into their direction. Having done so, They were ready to deal either as friend or as foe with the approaching human body belonging to that thinking. What really happens when the average white man and a rattlesnake suddenly and unexpectedly meet? Having been taught to regard all snakes as loathsome and deadly enemies with no rights whatsoever on earth, the man wants to kill every snake he sees. Something intensely emotional, savage, and violent begins churning within him, filling him with repugnance, horror, and alarm. At the same time, all sorts of malevolent factors latent in his nature flare up and thoroughly poison his state of mind. This invisible weapon, this deadly thought thing, he focuses upon the rattlesnake with lethal intent. Highly sensitive to this mental attack and keenly aware of its source, the rattlesnake by rapid thought action poisons its own state of mind and turns it toward the white man with equally malicious intent. Up to this point, the conflict between man and snake is mental and emotional. It is a kind of thought vendetta, a condition of mutual ill feeling in which each strikes at the other with destructive attitudes and intentions. If the white man happens to have a material weapon and is able successfully to use it, he kills the snake's physical body. If, however, the snake manages to avoid the blow and gets within range, it buries its well-poisoned fangs in some part of the white man's body, and the man keeps the rendezvous with death. While the snake may victoriously jab its fangs into the white man's body, what it really strikes at is the unsocial and deadly thinking that animates the body. Watching a real American Indian walk into the vicinity of this same rattlesnake, you would witness something entirely different. For one thing, you would be unable to detect the least sign of fear or hostility in either one. As they came fairly close, you could see them pause, calmly contemplate each other for a few minutes in the friendliest fashion, then move on their respective ways again, each attending strictly to his own business and extending the same privilege to the other. During that pause between them, they were in understanding communication with each other, like a big and small ship at sea exchanging friendly messages. Could you look deep into the thinking and motives of the Indian, you would discover the simple secret of it all, for you would find that he was moving as best he knew how in conscious rhythm with what he reverently called the Big Holy, the great primary principle of all life, which creates and animates all things and speaks wisdom through each one all the time. Because of this universally operating law, the Indian was in silent and friendly communion with the big rattler, not as a snake that had been to be much feared and destroyed, but as a much admired and much loved younger brother, who was entitled to as much life, liberty, happiness, respect, and consideration as he had hoped to enjoy himself. His younger brother had reacted accordingly. Chapter 21, Tail Rattlings. Even the most dreaded of poisonous snakes is a kindly disposed fellow at heart. He wants to be understood and to understand. He makes a wise and loving companion and will always share his best whenever the human does his part in the relationship. This is no doubt hard to believe, but I have seen it proved again and again in various parts of the world with all sorts of killer snakes. The proof has been established by a number of unusual men and women, all of whom moved out of the same operating basis that Strongheart had taught me to observe with him, the premise that harmonious relationships are possible only after they had first been made so mentally. One of the most interesting of these rare people was a slight and most unassuming little woman named Grace, who had the summer of 1948 made illuminating snake history at her Zoo for Happiness, not far from Long Beach, California. Miss Wiley had long experience as a herpetologist and was considered one of the world's most skilled handlers of snakes with bad reputations. Indeed, the tougher, the meaner, and the more venomous they were, the better she liked them. In her Zoo for Happiness, one could find almost every known kind of a snake, enormous king cobras over 25 feet long, Egyptian cobras, adders, copperheads, vipers, Australian black snakes, green mambas, tiger snakes, fer de lances, moccasins, all varieties of rattlesnakes, and many others. People came from all over to see the collection and to watch Miss Wiley handle the snakes. Visitors were permitted to handle them too, under her watchful supervision. People also were drawn there as students to listen to her interpret the snakes from the point of view of the snakes themselves. With one of her deadly specimens nestling affectionately in her arms, she would show to fascinated audience what splendid philosophical teachers and companions snakes can really be when given an opportunity. Would usually close these talks with the observation that deep within its heart the snake is not a troublemaker, but a fine gentleman, and that when he strikes he does so because someone with evil intent has invaded his domain and cornered, frightened, or hurt him. Watching this soft-spoken little woman prove these principles with all kinds of dangerous snakes was a breathtaking experience. This phase of her work was carried on in what was known as the gentling room, a severely bare place with a heavily built oblong table in the exact center. Most visitors were not permitted in this room when she was gentling a snake because of the danger involved, but there was a glass arrangement in one of the doors through which the privileged few were able to watch what went on. Watching from this safe point of vantage, one sees Miss Wiley quietly enter the room, take a position just far off the end of the table, and become as motionless as the table itself. In each hand she holds an odd-looking stick about 3 feet long. One of these has a cup-like mesh arrangement at the end of it. This is used for stopping and pushing back the heads of striking snakes. The other end of the stick is padded with soft cloth and is known as a petting stick. A large box with warning signs all over it is wheeled into the room and placed on the table. Loud, clattering, spine-tingling sounds coming through top and sides of the box proclaim the presence of a rattlesnake. At a nod from Miss Wiley, the rear end of the box is elevated, the front part jerked off, and out into a new world of experience slides Mr. Snake. And what a snake! He is over 6 feet in length, beautifully designed, filled with tremendous energy, and just about as deadly and menacing as they come. He is a magnificent specimen of diamondback rattler, newly arrived from deep in the heart of Texas, where snakes grow pretty big and pretty tough. As the snake hits the table, there is a flash of movement, almost too fast for the eyes to follow. The swift coiling of its body into a defense or attack position. The big fellow from Texas is set to fight anyone or anything for survival. But, to his obvious astonishment and bewilderment, there is nothing to fight. There is no moving target, only the bare walls and the motionless woman facing him. The snake's head darts apprehensively in all directions, trying to discover from which direction trouble is coming from. His tail rattles furious warnings, but nothing happens, nothing at all. Why does Miss Wiley not do something with the sticks in her hands? Why does the snake, with all its noise and threatenings, not take at least a practice lunge at Miss Wiley with its poison fangs? The truth is that Miss Wiley has been doing a most important something to the big snake ever since it came sliding out of the box, but you could not tell she was doing it because it was entirely mental. What was really happening was not just the outward meeting of a woman and a snake, rather it was the exploratory coming together for the first time of two invisible individualities, of two states of mind, of two puzzled and wondering kinsfolk who were about to discover that they really were related in the great plan and purpose of life. From the moment that Miss Wiley first saw the big snake, she had been silently talking across to it. Outwardly, she appeared to be doing nothing at all. Actually, she was proving the potency and effectiveness of her favorite rule of action in all relationship contacts, that all life, regardless of its form, classification, or reputation, will respond to genuine interest, respect, appreciation, admiration, affection, gentleness, courtesy, good manners. The big tail rattler was being lovingly showered with these qualities, undoubtedly for the first time in its experience. Had your ears been tuned to the silent universal language of the heart, you would have heard in detail the flow of soundless good talk that was moving from Miss Wiley to the snake. Not down at it as a lower form of life, but across to it as a fellow expression of life. And in that good talk, among other things, you would have heard her praising the snake for its many excellent qualities, assuring it that it had absolutely nothing to fear, and reminding it again and again that it had simply come to a new home where it would always be appreciated, loved, and cared for. All of this was communicated without the slightest sound or gesture from Miss Wiley. After a while, you would notice a marked change in the snake's attitude. The fast rattling of its tail was slowing down. Its head, which had been glaring in all directions at a fast, nervous tempo, was steadying itself in the direction of Miss Wiley. Even though it could not clearly distinguish the motionless woman from the motionless wall behind her, the killer from Texas was not only feeling, but actually responding to the friendly thoughts and feelings being sent in its direction. As Miss Wiley continued her reassuring talk, but now in low, soft vocal tones, you would witness the blossoming of this unique gentling technique. You would see the big snake slowly uncoil and cautiously stretch itself the full length of the table, finally resting its head within inches of where Miss Wiley was standing. Then the first physical movement by Miss Wiley, as she reached across and began gently stroking the snake's back, in the beginning with a soft padded petting stick, and then, there being no resistance, with her two bare hands. And as you watched this almost unbelievable performance, you would have seen the snake arch its long back in cat-like undulations in order better to feel the affection-filled ministrations. At that precise moment in the gentling process, another deadly, poisonous snake had become a member in good standing of the Zoo for Happiness. Miss Wiley had again demonstrated the fact that regardless of appearances, good is latent in every living thing, and simply needs to be called into active expression through the gracious application of respect, sympathetic understanding, gentleness, and love. Indians were penetrating in their scrutiny of my character and motives. Finally, I was admitted through the invisible gate which had separated the real American Indian with his great wealth of wisdom from the white man. I had to learn that unless one can first walk in mental and spiritual rhythm with an Indian, he cannot really walk with him at all. I became inner friends with an unusually colorful Indian chief. He was all that a man in his position is supposed to be. He was superlative in the role he played in the earth scene. Under all tests, he was a credit to his species, his tribe, and the world he so graced unforgettably. Among the Indians, he was particularly admired and respected for his moral worth, and for his clear inseeing, that is, his ability to see into causes and realities behind sense phenomena. He was also greatly esteemed for his wisdom, reticence, physical stamina, fearlessness, leadership qualities, and for his expertness in riding naked ponies. Astride one of those ponies and in motion, he was magnificent. Watching him ride was an experience to be grateful for. Until I reached the point where I could talk with him in that universal speech which does not have to be uttered, communication between the chief and me had to be carried on mostly in sign language with the help of an interpreter. The chief spoke very little English by preference, and even when he spoke in his own Indian language, his words were few, carefully selected, widely spaced, and discreetly guarded. He was far more interested in listening to the silent, universal language which was being spoken through all things, all about him, all the time. Late one afternoon, as the chief, the interpreter, and I sat in the lap of Mother Earth watching a lovely sunset, I asked the chief, through our interpreter, if he would tell me the Indian secret of riding a pony without bridle, saddle, or blanket. A profound silence followed, which lasted over an hour. Then a few sounds came rumbling from the chief. The interpreter turned in my direction. "The chief says that you have asked a good question," he said. There was another long silence. "Is that all?" I finally asked the interpreter. He nodded. Thereafter, whenever the three of us were together, I would always find some excuse for asking the chief about riding naked ponies, but I never got an answer. I did not understand this at the time. Later I realized that I was on character probation. Most unexpectedly one day, when I had forgotten to ask my favorite question, the chief wanted to know why I was interested in Indian pony riding. I told him through the interpreter that because of what the dog Strongheart had taught me about relations with animals, I was trying to learn all I could about that mysterious bond which holds all created things in inseparable and harmonious kinship. I said that I believed his pony riding secret could furnish much help for me in that direction. For some time the three of us sat still. Then the chief began slowly intoning words in his own language, aiming them at the horizon line. When he had finished, the interpreter began speaking. "The chief wants me to tell you that for you to full know what you have asked, you would have to be Indian born, Indian taught, and grow up with an Indian pony as your brother. Then you would understand the great mystery. You would be part of the great mystery. But he will tell you something about it in sign language, and he says for you to catch what you can." The chief held up his two rugged hands with their palms in my direction. After a pause, he placed them gently together in front of his face as though in prayer. Another pause. Then his fingers came down until the tips of them rested on the backs of his hands. The two index fingers then came straight up, as though they were one finger. With his hands in that position, he slowly made a complete circle with them, finally stopping them in front of his face again and looking at me with a questioning expression on his face. What I caught from this rhythmical sign language was this. When the chief held his two hands in my direction, I intuitively knew that one of them symbolized an Indian and the other a pony. When his two hands touched in front of his face, it meant friendly and understanding contact between an Indian and pony. When the fingers intercrossed and came down onto the backs of his hands, it signified an interrelating of all their interests. When the two index fingers steepled up, it represented togetherness, blended into oneness. And when he made the complete circle with his hands in that position, it indicated that Indian and pony were functioning as a single unit in heart, mind, body, and purpose. The interpreter told me that I had made a good catch. Whenever the chief met an animal or any other living thing, he would pause and establish a mental contact with it. While the physical part of the chief walked the earth, the mental and the spiritual part of him moved in boundless space, embracing all creation in a comprehensive kinship in which all things were important and all things needed in a divine plan and purpose. Ever helping him to understand and move in rhythm with all creation was his companion, counselor, guide, and helper, the Big Holy. The chief never read books, magazines, or newspapers. He never listens to the radio and never watches television. Whenever he wants to know the latest news, whenever he needs fresh wisdom, mental diversion, spiritual nourishment, or clearer vision about some particular problem, he goes to what he calls the Great Library. Other people call it the universe. The volumes he consults in this library are the sun, the moon, the stars, the clouds, growing things, his favorite pony, and all sorts of other animate and inanimate things. Chapter 23, Golden Thread. After knowing the American Indian chief, I met another chief, a Bedouin of the Arabian desert. These two men, living thousands of miles apart, would naturally be considered complete aliens, yet they share a common vision and move in almost precisely the same mental, spiritual, and physical realms. Their lives are held together by the same golden thread. I wish it were possible for you, these two chiefs, and me to sit cross-legged on the ground and share a good talk with one another. It would be a profitable occasion, that I guarantee. But getting these two chiefs really to open up would require careful persuasion. Both talk as little as possible, finding it more to their advantage to keep wrapped in silence so that they can better hear the voice of existence. We could start things rolling by asking the Bedouin chief about the world-famous Arabian horses and camels that he raises. Perhaps he would share with us the secret of how he and his animals accomplish their most incredible mutual understanding and cooperation. The Bedouin's gentle and modestly spoken words would reveal the reason for his success with horses and camels. It lay basically in the fine quality of his thinking about them. This thinking preceded him when he moved in their direction. It continued with them while he was in their presence. It remained with them like a benediction after he left them. His thinking expressed genuineness, sincerity, admiration, appreciation, respect, affection, a sense of fellowship in being, humility, unselfishness, sympathy, and a desire to share his best and only his best with his animals. The horses and camels felt the impact of this gracious thinking even before the physical part of the chief came into view. In everything he said about his horses and camels, he gave them a mental and spiritual rating equal with his own. He regarded them as celestial creatures, and he never spoke of them without in some way paying tribute to the divine qualities within it. As a result of this, the horses and camels responded to him with the best they had in mind and heart, as well as with the best they could contribute in physical action. When one of his animals is in foal, the chief takes his prayer rug and spends as much time as possible kneeling and sitting with the four-legged mother and her unborn colt. During these sessions, he talks eternal verities to them. He reads the best Oriental literature to them. He recites to them from the Koran. He meditates and prays with them. Grasping the far-reaching significance of this, we would come into possession of one of the most important reasons for the exceptional looks, intelligence, disposition, achievements, and popularity of the chief's horses and camels. Had we asked the chief how he acquired his extraordinary knowledge of animals, he would have told us that it came from the only source it could have come from, that is God. That God with his infinite wisdom, power, and purpose pervaded the universe, and that wherever one looked, he could always see God shining through all things and hear him speaking wisdom through all things. Then the Bedouin would have touched his palms in front of his face, whispered a brief prayer, and bowed a blessing in our direction. As we prevailed upon the American Indian chief to share some of his experiences with us, we would discover how intimately interrelated these two chiefs were in the manner in which they moved with animals as rational fellow beings, as kith and kin, and as complementary partners in everything they did. Also in the similar way in which each of them went about removing from their contacts with animals every least thing that operated against shared interests, shared loyalties, shared consideration, and shared results. Had we asked the Indian chief, as we did the Bedouin, how he came by his unusual relationship knowledge and the ability to make it work the way he did, we would have heard him give full credit to the Big Holy. Then, with a few carefully selected nouns, accompanied by simple pictures made in the air with his two hands, he would have assured us that when one has the right sea and the all-good heart, then, wherever he happens to be, he can always find the Big Holy breathing life into all things, making all things of one essence, and speaking wisdom through all things, thus giving everything that lives not only creator importance, creator needfulness, and creator usefulness, but making all things persons and brothers. Of course, nothing original in what the Bedouin and the Indian accomplished by recognizing animals as being on mental and spiritual communicating levels with themselves. Job recommended the same practice many centuries ago. Ask the very beasts, and they will teach you. Ask the wild birds, they will tell you. Crawling creatures will instruct you. Fish in the sea will inform you. For which of them all knows not that this is the Eternal's way, in whose control lies every living soul, and the whole life of man? Neither of our two chiefs had ever read the Bible or heard of Job, yet each of them in wildly separated parts of the world were successfully following Job's advice. The Bedouin and the Indian were indeed going to the very beasts and to the wild birds and to crawling creatures for wisdom, reassurance, and guidance in the eternal ways.